Joining us live in studio is Doron Avital, former Commander of Special Forces, the IDF, and International Affairs Analyst Dan Perry, former Europe and Middle East editor for the Associated Press. All right, Lieutenant Colonel and Dan, thank you very much. So, all right, we've just heard these reports, and this is obviously very disturbing, especially, after just a few days ago having the conversation about the ICJ decision, and now to have casualties. Not good.
It's clear the world has run out of patience with civilian casualties in Gaza. This happened long ago, and Israel simply cannot afford to continue making these kinds of mistakes. To a certain extent, when you operate as you do in an urban area full of civilians, tragic as it is, you have to price it in, but it has to be priced in at a very high premium. It can't happen. And clearly, one or two more such incidents, and the pressure to just stop the war is going to be overwhelming. So Israel must project convincingly, but really convincingly, that this is a mistake that is maximally regretted, completely investigated, and will not recur. This government during this war has not been great at doing that. And it simply must end what appears to be, to the world, a degree of indifference about the civilian situation in Gaza. As for the Egyptians, I can only agree. It's not a worst case scenario. The worst case scenario is worse, but it's really bad, really bad. That also needs to be investigated to the hilt, because we don't know why it came to be that Egyptians and Israelis are firing on each other, but that can't happen. The peace with Egypt is a cornerstone of Israel's entire existential strategy. It must not happen. Now, the Egyptians are a little persnickety about everything about the border. It seemed a bit bizarre that they were so obsessed with Israel not taking over Rafah, but if now they're somehow put in a, because they too want Hamas to be eliminated from power in Gaza. They just do. So you'd think they would get that. Whatever is the reason for what happened today, it must be understood. And currently, I have to say, at least from where we sit, it doesn't appear to be quite yet.
All right, well, we'll obviously get more information, on that. But also, we're talking, with the fact that there were fires. So we still don't know about these 45. It's also numbers that were released by Hamas. So it hasn't been independently confirmed. But for fires, and this was not the designated humanitarian zone, according to Nicole. So obviously, mistakes were made, but
you know what? It's really important, if I may, to really emphasize how obvious it is that this was a mistake. I'm not saying all mistakes are justifiable. You can have a mistake that comes from incompetence or complacency, but to hear critics around the world talking about how Israel is killing civilians as if it was on purpose really is unfair, bordering on idiotic, when it's so obvious Israel suffers from this. I mean, it's tragic for the victims, but Israel clearly doesn't want it. It must project that message more convincingly and more
well, so many world leaders, people are saying that Israel is intentionally targeting, and we know that's not true. That is not the cornerstone of the Jewish state nor the IDF. So clarify that.
No, but we should recall that campaigns in the past, like the campaign of '96 in Lebanon, ended with a tragic mistake of an artillery that killed some civilian. Clearly a mistake in identifying the enemy, and a mistake of the artillery. So those kind of events, though of course not intentional, there's no question about that, can really bring into a halt a military campaiign.
What more can actually be done to quell that rising tide? We're doing this on purpose.
So there's two things. Well, three things. First of all, shut down the criminally stupid conversation by extremists who say things that can be used by Israel's enemies or by confused people in the world who happen to work for the ICC or the ICJ to present Israel's intentions inaccurately. Number two, public diplomacy. Israel's public diplomacy in this war has been execrable. I'd give it an F. If there was an F-, I'd give it an F-. They act as if they don't care what the world's going to think. They have a very good case. Israel's justification in this war was very strong. The prosecution of the war may not have been to my liking throughout, but the justification is there. They hardly bothered making a case. It was all internal messaging. And three, you cannot maintain world support for a military operation this devastating, without making it seem as if you're headed somewhere reasonable. And Israel, in refusing to discuss the end game because the extremists in the government would endanger its Netanyahu's survival in power, in refusing to discuss the end game because of these extremists, it has just lost world support. You cannot bring about this level of damage to civilians and appear to be doing it for no particular reason. And leave the world with the suspicion that it's somehow revenge. Now you can say, well, other democratic countries got away with it, and look at what the Americans did in Mosul. That's the Americans. Israel is a small to mid-sized country, very powerful, very impressive, but it depends on the world's goodwill. And the population of Israel must understand losing the goodwill of the entire world.
It's consequences.
It's not, yes, especially as an export-dependent economy and a wealthy export-dependent economy that wants to maintain its wealth. You cannot be indifferent to world opinion, and this government is. The question is how to get it to change or how to bring it down.
Also, from a military perspective, we have to understand that an army must follow some effective target that it has to achieve. So if the target is to eliminate all enemy soldiers, it's not, no war ever in the history of warfare had ended by killing all your enemy soldiers. So you have to have some end game, and you have an end game, you can be in sync with the Egyptian, you can be in sync with your allies, and something can be worked out towards this end. Since there's no end game, it seems like it was presented there as if this is a killing that goes nowhere.
We're hearing, obviously, any talk's going to be stalled. How could that be ameliorated? I mean, we're hearing I24 himself. I mean, to be able to hear him, I mean, all of the months that people are protesting outside of the war cabinet, it's not that often that you hear from him saying something this strong, if ever.
This is part and parcel of what is going to be growing pressure inside Israel and also inside the cabinet in the form of I24 and Gantz, the more moderate elements, to end the war. To end a war in terms that Israel would have considered unacceptable 6 months ago. And Hezbollah's strategy is to further that dynamic by projecting to Israelis that this unacceptable situation in the north, which the government seems to have accepted for now, can end. That they will stop what is basically brought life to a standstill in the north if Israel ends the war. In other words, to add to Israel's motivation to more or less abdicate one of their two goals, which was never leave Gaza with any version of Hamas still intact. And you're going to hear in coming weeks, unless the Rafah operation obliterates Hamas, we can assess how likely or unlikely that is. If that doesn't happen, and the war promises to go on for another year this way, with these unacceptable prices internationally, domestically, economically, reputationally, diplomatically, if there's no other option, you're going to start hearing that it's time to bring back all the hostages by meeting Hamas's condition and ending the war. They've been punished, they've been degraded, but they're left in power. Collect peace with Saudi Arabia, try to organize some new reality in Gaza, end the disaster up north, create a regional military umbrella against Iran. A lot of pretty good outcomes for Israel.
What would it take for that to happen?
For Israel to have a different government.
A new government.
This government can't allow that. The extremists won't allow it. So really, if you consider this to be an acceptable endgame for Israel, and the only way to save the hostages, then rarely has there been a more howling need for a government that was democratically elected somehow to be replaced and quickly. And I have to think that Netanyahu, who I can criticize on a lot of dimensions, but not on the intellectual level, must understand this. And therefore, I have to think that if the opposition, having failed miserably to win the election in November 2022, really, just ridiculously bad campaign, having failed to bring down the government despite the outrageous unpopularity and failings of this government, if they have failed in those two twin duties, then their third duty is to rescue not just Israel, but it kind of looks like humanity and democracy in the Western world by allowing Netanyahu to set up a rational coalition.
So, final thoughts, Lieutenant Colonel. I mean, obviously, would stopping the war to release the hostages, would it be considered a loss of the war based on the stated effort to eliminate Hamas?
A little bit.
If you promise to stop the war for for the next 5 years, for sure. But if you come to some ceasefire for a few months and then some humanitarian hostage deal and then some exchange, maybe violation here and there, and the war continues.
Which chances are, even if there was, Hamas would violate it.
This really has to be
even
emphasized.
Ceasefire.
Even if this war ends with Hamas somehow somewhat empowering Gaza, It doesn't mean Israel can't fight them again, this time without the disadvantage of the hostages, if they violate conditions. And Israel should never again accept the status quo ante of October 7th. Never again should the Gaza Strip be able to threaten Israel the way it did. And I have to assume, because Hamas's DNA is not rational, they're going to do a violation and the war will resume.
This is a war in many fronts, the north, the south, diplomatically, and in a war you have to decide when to do what. And it's not like you do everything all the time in the same fashion, in the same magnitude. So I think we'll have to be smarter in this context, try to reach a hostage deal, some ceasefire, and then see what's next.
All right, thank you both very much.